The autumn wind swept across Washington County, Maryland, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant gunpowder. It was October 1862, and the Civil War had turned the once peaceful farmlands into a landscape of fear and uncertainty. Leander, Kenny's plantation, sat like a festering wound on the outskirts of Boonesboro, a modest estate by Southern standards but no less brutal. The main house overlooked fields worked by 15 souls who owned nothing, not even their own names in the eyes of the law. Kenny himself was a paradox. An Irishman who'd fled famine and oppression, he had somehow transformed his own suffering into a weapon against those even more powerless. His red hair had thinned, his face grown jowly with whiskey, but his pale blue eyes still held the cold calculation of a man who measured his worth in others' suffering. Among the enslaved workers was Jerome, a 32, whose intelligence showed in the careful way he moved through the world. He'd learned early that survival meant making yourself valuable while never appearing threatening. He could read a secret he guarded like a knife and understood the rhythms of planting and harvest better than Kenny himself, Jerome's wife. Naomi was 26, her belly swollen with their first child. She'd arrived 3 years earlier, traded for a mule and 2 barrels of salted pork. Her hands would rest on her stomach, whispering promises to the child within, promises of a better world that both knew might be lies. The plantation had a place the workers called the dark place, a barn at the far edge where Kenny took those who displeased him. Simple timber turned almost black with age. No windows. A single door that could be barred from outside. Inside, darkness was absolute. Jerome had been inside twice. 3 days for teaching another worker to read. A week for looking Kenny in the eye too long. He remembered the hunger, the thirst, the way time dissolved. The sounds Kenny made outside, scratching, howling, banging metal, designed to strip away sanity. But what Jerome remembered most was the cold. Even in summer, the dark place held bone-deep chill. The workers said the ground was cursed, that the Piscataway tribe had avoided it for generations, calling it the mouth of the earth. It was late October when everything changed. Naomi had been working in the kitchen garden when Kenny found fault with her work. His voice rose to that pitch that meant violence was coming. Jerome, in the nearby stable, heard the commotion and arrived in time to see Kenny strike Naomi across the face, hard enough to knock her sideways. She caught herself, one hand protecting her belly. Jerome's vision went white, every muscle tensing. But Naomi's eyes found his, a plea. Stay alive, for me, for the child. That evening, lying on their thin blanket, Naomi whispered, "I felt the baby move today." Right before he hit me, Jerome's hand found hers. "We're going to get out of here. I don't want our child born into hoping," she said. "I want them born into something real." 3 days later, on October 28th, Jerome woke to Kenny's bell, earlier than usual, which meant trouble. Naomi had been having pains since midnight, sharp cramps that came and went. "Stay here," Jerome whispered. "I'll tell them you're sick." But Naomi knew what happened when they couldn't work. "I'll manage." Jerome found the overseer, Dalton Pierce, near the main house. "My wife's ill." "The baby, something's wrong." Pierce spat tobacco. "Kenny don't pay for sick days. She works, or she goes to the dark place." "She's 8 months pregnant," Jerome said, his voice harder than intended. The blow from Pierce's riding crop split his lip. "You forget your place?" What happened next unfolded with terrible inevitability. Pierce dragged Naomi from the quarters despite her protests, despite Jerome's pleading, despite her cries that the baby was coming early. Kenny emerged, already drunk. His eyes settled on Naomi's belly with something like amusement. "Pregnant. You people breed like animals. Think that gives you privileges?" "Mr. Kenny, please." Jerome stepped forward, dignity abandoned. "She's in real pain. Just let her rest one day. I'll do her work and mine both." Kenny smiled, the smile Jerome had learned to fear. The dark place. 3 days. Jerome heard himself shouting, "No!" felt his body moving forward, his hands closing on Kenny's shirt. Then everything exploded into pain as Pierce's crop struck his skull. When Jerome woke, bound in the stable, old Moses sat beside him. "She's in the dark place. Been there since morning. Jerome pulled against his bonds. "The baby?" "I know," Moses said heavily. "But if you try something now, he'll kill you. Then who helps your wife? Who helps them if I do nothing?" Moses leaned closer, voice dropping. "There's talk among the others about running on Halloween night, 3 days from now. Kenny and Pierce are riding to Richmond that night to sell some of us. Place will be unguarded, 3 days. The same 3 days, Naomi would be locked in darkness. I need to get to her," Jerome said. Tonight, that night, Jerome slipped away after Pierce cut him loose. He reached the dark place as the moon rose and lifted the heavy bar from the door. The smell hit him first, blood and death. His hands found Naomi in the corner, still breathing but barely. In her arms, something small and cold and still. Their child, dead. "They killed our baby," Naomi whispered, her voice strange and broken. Before it could even draw breath, Jerome gathered them both, feeling something inside him calcify into stone. "We need to get you help." "No, not yet." Her grip on his arm was surprisingly strong. "First, I need to tell you what's in here with us. What I've made a bargain with." Jerome felt his neck prickle. "What are you talking about?" "The darkness. It's alive. It's been feeding on suffering for years, and it's hungry. It wants Kenny. It wants Pierce. It wants everyone who hurt us." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And I told it yes." Hoofbeats approached, Pierce returning early from town. Jerome made a decision. "I'm putting you back, just until tomorrow night. I'll come with the others. We'll end this together." He settled her against the wall, their dead child still in her arms, then slipped back into shadows as Pierce rode into the yard. October 31st, Halloween, was hours away, and on that night, Washington County would learn what true horror looked like. October 31st dawned with unseasonable fog that rolled across the plantation like a living thing. Jerome woke with sharp purpose. Today everything ended. 7 men were part of the plan. Old Moses, brothers Samuel and Eli, Marcus, who'd lost fingers to Kenny's punishment, 18-year-old Isaiah, whose father Kenny had killed, Jacob, who'd survived the dark place, and Jerome himself. Kenny emerged mid-morning, looking worse than usual. "Pierce, get the wagon ready. We leave at nightfall for Richmond." Jerome's stomach clenched. They were taking 4 slaves to sell: Samuel, Eli, Sarah, and Marcus. But then Pierce suggested leaving Moses to keep order, taking someone else instead. The morning dragged with agonizing slowness. Around noon, something strange happened. The fog grew thicker, denser, dropping the temperature noticeably. The air took on an oppressive quality, like before a thunderstorm. Kenny stared at the fog with visible unease. "What in hell is this?" "It's Halloween," one of the women muttered. "The veil is thin today. Check on that woman in the barn," Kenny told Pierce. Pierce disappeared into the fog toward the dark place. Then he screamed, not anger or alarm, but pure terror. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by wet choking. Kenny drew his pistol, hands shaking. "Pierce, answer me!" No response. Just the fog, thick and wrong. Then Pierce emerged. Same clothes, same build. But he moved wrong, limbs bending at impossible angles. His throat was torn open, yet he walked. His eyes glowed with something ancient and malevolent. "Leander Kenny," multiple voices said through Pierce's mouth. Men, women, children, all who'd suffered in the dark place. "We've been waiting for you." Kenny fired. The bullet struck Pierce's chest, and the thing looked down curiously. "Iron and lead cannot harm what's already dead." Kenny ran. The Pierce thing followed leisurely, as if it had all the time in the world. Jerome broke from his paralysis and ran toward the dark place. Inside, the darkness pulsed with sickly greenish light. Naomi sat against the wall, still holding their child. But she'd changed. Her eyes held something vast and inhuman. "You came back," she said in those multiple harmonics. "Good, we've been preparing. Naomi, what happened to you?" "I died, or I'm dying. Hard to tell anymore. But before I go, I'm going to make them all pay." She stood, moving too fluidly. "The darkness and I made a deal. 7 men, Kenny, Pierce, we've started. And 5 others. 5 others? Kenny's sons." The fog called them back from their battlefield. Dalton's brother who helped build this place. The sheriff who looked away. And the banker who financed it all. Outside, Kenny screamed. Then the scream cut off with the sound of tearing meat. "That's 2. Naomi smiled terribly. 5 more to go, and you're going to help." Jerome thought of his dead child, of years of suffering. "What do you need us to do?" The fog transformed the plantation into nightmare. The Pierce thing dragged Kenny's body across the yard, still alive, still screaming. Naomi emerged from the dark place, her skin translucent now, something vast moving beneath it. Moses and the others had followed Jerome. They stared at Naomi with mixed horror and fascination. "For 15 years, this place fed on our suffering," Naomi said. "Now it's hungry for justice." 3 riders materialized from the fog, Kenny's sons Thomas and William in blood-soaked Confederate uniforms, and Sheriff Porter. All looked wrong, pale as death. "Where's our father?" Thomas demanded. "Your father's dead," Jerome said simply. The Pierce thing erupted from the fog, striking William and dragging him back into the white murk. Terrible sounds followed, tearing, crunching, screaming. 3, Naomi's voice drifted out. 4 more! Thomas and Porter fired wildly into the fog. Then shapes appeared within the white, human-shaped but wrong. Ghosts of those who died on this plantation, called back by darkness and Halloween's thin veil. One shape moved toward Thomas. He fired, the bullet passing through without effect. The ghost's smoky hands closed around his throat. Porter broke and ran, but the fog wrapped around him like a living thing, pulling him down. His hand reached up through the white murk, grasping at nothing before disappearing. 5, Naomi said. 2 more. A carriage burst into the yard. Ezekiel Cross, the banker, face panicked. He looked around wildly, taking in the blood and fog and armed workers. "I didn't know what Kenny was doing," Cross stammered. "I just provided capital." "You knew," Naomi's voice cut across his protests. "You knew every time you heard the screams and laughed because their suffering made you rich." The fog rose behind Cross like a wall, faces visible within it, dozens, maybe hundreds. Every person who died in bondage, all called back, all hungry for justice. Cross fell to his knees, weeping. "Please, I have children." "So did we," Isaiah said quietly. The fog consumed Cross. His screams joined the chorus, drifting through the Halloween night. 6, Naomi said. 1 more. The final figure appeared. Marcus Pierce, Dalton's brother, a big man with hard eyes. He'd felt his brother's death and come to investigate despite every instinct screaming to run. He drew his pistol. "You're all going to hang." "Your brother said something similar," Moses replied. Pierce aimed at Jerome, finger tightening. But Naomi was there, impossibly fast, her translucent hand closing around his wrist. 7, she whispered. Her touch burned like ice. Pierce screamed as his skin blackened, necrosis racing up his arm. He dropped the pistol and fell, convulsing, as darkness poured into him. 3 minutes later, Marcus Pierce died. The fog began receding, pulling back toward the dark place. Naomi stood in the center of the yard, still holding their child. She looked at Jerome, tears on her translucent cheeks. "It's done. 7 men dead. 7 debts paid. And you?" Jerome's voice broke. "I died giving birth in that barn. This was just the echo of me, the rage given form. But it's fading." She was right. Her form grew more transparent. "I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. But at least we made them pay. At least we mattered." "You mattered," Jerome said through tears. "You always mattered." Then she was gone. Just fog and memory. The darkness retreated into the ground, satisfied. Halloween, 1862 in Washington County ended. Jerome stood surrounded by corpses, wondering what came next. November 1st dawned cold and clear. Jerome sat on the forbidden porch of the main house, staring at his clean hands that still felt covered in phantom blood. 7 bodies lay scattered, Kenny with his throat torn out, his sons with necks at unnatural angles, Sheriff Porter gray-skinned, Cross with wounds no earthly weapon could make. The Pierce brothers hollowed out, consumed spiritually. Old Moses brought coffee from Kenny's stores, the first meal as free people. "What do we do now?" "When people find these bodies," Jerome said, "they'll hunt us down. Doesn't matter what really happened, so we run," Moses agreed. "Question is where." They debated options: Canada via Underground Railroad, Union Army lines, or splitting up. Isaiah suggested a bold plan. "We burn it all. Make it look like the Union Army did it. Then claim we escaped in the chaos." The group agreed. They raided Kenny's stores, loaded a wagon with supplies, and prepared to separate into groups. Jerome with Moses and Marcus heading north, others going different directions. Before leaving, they set fires. The main house caught quickly, then the slave quarters. Finally, Jerome carried a torch to the dark place. "This is for you," he whispered, thinking of Naomi, "so no one else suffers here." The dark place burned hot and fast, as if eager to be consumed. Jerome saw shapes in the flames, faces of all who'd suffered there, finally released. The group separated, each heading different directions. Jerome looked back once and saw 3 pillars of fire rising like a funeral pyre. "You think we'll see each other again?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," Jerome answered honestly. They rode north in silence. Behind them, smoke rose into the clear autumn sky, visible for miles. Moses spoke quietly. "You're wondering if it was worth it." "Every damn minute," Jerome admitted. 7 men dead. How do we live with that? Same way we lived with everything else. One day at a time. We survive because that's what we've always done. That night, camping in a grove of trees, Jerome lay awake thinking about Naomi, about their child who never drew breath, about the terrible price of one night's vengeance. He made himself a promise. He would survive, would reach Union lines, would fight for the freedom Naomi had bought with her life. And someday he would tell their story, not the supernatural horror. No one would believe that. But the rest, the cruelty, the suffering, the terrible price of saying enough, that story needed to be told. 3 days of hard travel brought them within sight of Union encampments near Frederick. 3 days of moving at night, hiding during the day, constantly alert. A young sentry challenged them. "State your business." "We're freed people," Jerome called. "Escaped from a plantation near Boonesboro during a Confederate raid. Seeking refuge and offering our services." The sentry called his sergeant who studied them. "The Kenny plantation. Every damn person in Washington County has heard about it. 7 men dead, whole place burned. Locals say it was a slave uprising." "That's not what happened," Jerome said carefully. "There was a raid." "I don't care what happened," the sergeant interrupted. "That's above my pay grade." They were taken to Captain William Hartley, mid-30s, with the bearing of a combat veteran. He had them sit and pulled out paper, names: Jerome Freeman, Moses Carter, Marcus Washington. Hartley set down his pen. "I'll be frank. I don't believe your story about Confederate raiders. I think something else happened, something you don't want to talk about. And honestly, I don't blame you. Kenny had a reputation. Everyone knew what he was doing." He leaned back. "But here's the thing, I don't care what really happened. Kenny's dead, his enablers are dead. That's justice. The problem is, legally, you're still property until January, when the proclamation takes effect. If it comes out you killed your masters, justified or not, there will be hell to pay." Jerome's hope crumbled. "However," Hartley continued, "I have a proposal. The Union Army needs scouts who know this area. You work for me, officially as paid civilian scouts, and I'll make sure the paperwork gets lost regarding which plantation you came from." Moses spoke up. "You'd risk your career." "I've seen what slavery does," Hartley said. "If I can help 3 men who escaped it, who maybe took justice into their own hands, I'm going to do it. Consider it my contribution to whatever better world we're fighting for." Jerome looked at Moses and Marcus. "We accept." Over the following weeks, Jerome settled into his new role. The Union Army issued them clothes, weapons, and papers, identifying them as paid civilian employees. He scouted Confederate positions, guided patrols, and slowly understood the war's larger shape. Word reached him that Isaiah and Jacob had been caught and hanged as insurrectionists. Samuel and Eli's fate remained unknown. Sarah had died on their journey west. Of 15 people on the plantation Halloween night, only 3 were confirmed alive. A 30% survival rate. In December, Hartley called Jerome to his tent. "Kenny's relatives are making noise. His brother-in-law is a congressman pushing for an investigation. Will they find us?" "Not if I can help it. I've buried your paperwork deep. But stay with the army, keep your heads down, and don't talk about what really happened." Hartley hesitated, then asked, "What did really happen?" "I've heard strange stories. Fog, screaming, things that don't make sense. Bodies in conditions the coroner couldn't explain. That barn burned hotter than any normal fire should." Jerome met his eyes. What happened is that evil men got what they deserved. How that justice was delivered. Does it really matter?
Hartley studied him, then nodded.
No, I suppose it doesn't. Jerome thought about the question later. The truth of Halloween night lived inside him now, a weight he'd carry forever. But maybe that was right. Maybe some stories were meant to be remembered by only a few, held close like a knife. Naomi had given everything for one night of justice. Jerome would survive to see slavery abolished, to tell the parts of the story that could be told, the rest, the darkness, the vengeance. The 7 bodies would remain his burden alone, a secret written in blood, carried through time. Winter 1863 settled over Maryland. Jerome established himself as one of Hartley's most reliable scouts, but success brought attention, the last thing he wanted. In February, Moses brought disturbing news. There's talk in Boonesboro about Halloween. Kenny's brother-in-law hired private investigators. What are they finding? Stories that don't add up. Witnesses who heard screaming for hours. Locals who swear the fog was unnatural. Coroner's reports that don't match conventional violence. And 15 slaves who can't be accounted for. We covered our tracks. The bodies don't match any known violence, Moses interrupted. The investigators are calling it spiritual consumption. One investigator, Thaddeus Crane, has been reading Piscataway accounts about that land. About what lived there before Kenny built his plantation. He knows about the darkness. He's starting to understand. And that makes him dangerous, Marcus burst in. Hartley wants to see you now, and he doesn't look happy. They found Hartley with 2 strangers. Colonel Reynolds from Army headquarters and a well-dressed civilian with calculating eyes, Jerome Freeman, Hartley said formally. This is Colonel Reynolds and Mr. Thaddeus Crane, a private investigator. They have questions. Crane stepped forward. Mr. Freeman, you worked on the Kenny plantation for how many years? I was enslaved there for 8 years, until Halloween night when the plantation was attacked by Confederate raiders with no record of Confederate activity in that area, Crane said. No other plantations touched. Just the Kenny property, where 7 men died and 15 slaves disappeared. We didn't disappear. We escaped. We came to Union lines, with employment papers processed by Captain Hartley, bypassing normal channels. Quite convenient, Reynolds spoke up. Captain, falsifying military documents is a serious offense. I processed paperwork for 3 freed men, Hartley said tightly. According to regulations, Crane pulled out documents. The coroner's report describes wounds that couldn't be made by conventional weapons. Witnesses report screaming for hours, fog that defied natural explanation. The dark place burned at impossible temperatures. All 7 victims showed signs of supernatural violence. Supernatural, Reynolds scoffed. Surely you're not suggesting... I'm stating facts, Crane interrupted. Something happened that goes beyond a simple uprising. Something involving forces we don't understand. And I believe Mr. Freeman knows exactly what. All eyes turned to Jerome. He stood at a crossroads. Tell the impossible truth, stick to the lie, or find a third way. Mr. Crane, Jerome said carefully, you've studied the land. Talk to the Piscataway, so you understand some places are cursed. Some ground is poisoned by violence. Crane leaned forward. Go on. Kenny built on cursed ground. Built that barn over a boundary that should have been left alone. For 15 years, he fed it with suffering. Every scream, every drop of blood, it all sank into something that was waiting. The land itself killed those men? Reynolds sounded skeptical. Kenny and his accomplices got what they deserved, Jerome replied. Whether that justice came from people rising up or from the land refusing more suffering, does it matter? Either way, 7 cruel men are dead and 15 people are free. Crane studied him. You're being very careful with your words. Not confirming, not denying. But I think you were there. I think you saw what happened. I saw suffering end, Jerome said simply. I saw justice. Is that a crime? That depends on whether you participated in killing 7 men, Reynolds said. I participated in my own liberation. If that makes me a criminal, so be it. Silence fell. Finally, Crane spoke. I've spent weeks investigating, and my conclusion is that the truth is too dangerous to reveal. If I publish what I've learned about darkness, supernatural violence, ancient forces, it will cause panic. It will make martyrs of men like Kenny. He turned to Reynolds. I'm suggesting we accept the official story. Confederate raiders attacked Halloween night. 7 men died, 15 slaves escaped. Simple, clean, believable. You'd suppress your investigation. I'd preserve the truth that matters, Crane corrected. Kenny and his accomplices were evil men who got what they deserved. The people they enslaved are free. Everything else, the supernatural elements, that's not the story that needs telling. Not yet, he looked at Jerome. But someday, when the war is over, this story should be told. Not as evidence, but as testimony. As a record of what slavery drove people to. Jerome felt something loosen in his chest. Agreed, Reynolds sighed. Captain Hartley, your paperwork stands. Mr. Freeman continues as a scout. Mr. Crane, your report will be appropriately vague. Excessively vague, Crane confirmed. Outside, Jerome breathed hard, feeling like he'd escaped a noose. Moses and Marcus appeared. We're safe, Jerome said. For now. Crane knows the truth, but he's burying it. They stood together, 3 men carrying impossible memories. Strange thing, Moses said. We told something close to truth, and they chose to bury it. Not because they didn't believe us, but because believing would be too difficult. Some truths are like that, Jerome agreed. Too big to fit into the world as people understand it, but we'll remember, Marcus said. And someday maybe we'll tell it right, Jerome nodded. Someday. When there was space for stories about darkness and vengeance. Until then they would survive. They would fight. They would carry Halloween night like a torch in the darkness. And somewhere, Jerome believed, Naomi's spirit rested easier, knowing her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. 7 bodies. A revenge written in blood. 15 souls set free. That was the story that mattered. The war dragged on. 1863 bled into 1864. And Jerome continued as a Union scout, moving through Maryland like a shadow. The Emancipation Proclamation changed everything. The war was now about ending slavery. Jerome threw himself into the work, partly because it mattered, partly to avoid thinking about Halloween night. Moses and Marcus remained with him, the 3 forming a unit that Hartley relied on. In summer 1864, they guided cavalry through the area where Kenny's plantation had stood. Jerome had avoided that ground, but orders were orders. As they approached, Jerome felt his chest tighten. The ruins were still visible. Charred foundations, collapsed walls, blackened earth. Nature was reclaiming it, but something remained wrong. Horses grew nervous, soldiers uncomfortable. Lieutenant Morrison surveyed the ruins.
What happened?
Plantation burned during a Confederate raid, Jerome said automatically. Back in 62. Strange. The ground feels wrong. Something bad happened here for 15 years, Jerome replied quietly. The burning just ended it. They camped near the ruins that night. Jerome noticed no one would camp near where the dark place had stood. That ground remained bare. Nothing would grow there. Around midnight, Jerome woke to nervous horses. Morrison was up staring at the ruins. Did you hear that? Morrison asked. Hear what? Screaming. Like someone in terrible pain. Jerome's blood ran cold. The boundary was thin here, would always be thin. Just the wind. The sound came from there. Morrison pointed to the bare ground. Where nothing grows, neither slept well. Jerome lay listening to the wind, and underneath it, if you listened carefully, faint crying like a child who never lived. A woman's voice singing a lullaby. Naomi, still there somehow. Still tied to the ground where she died. Jerome whispered, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. The crying seemed to quiet, as if his words brought comfort to whatever remnant remained. They left at dawn. Jerome never returned to that place. In April 1865, news reached them. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The Confederacy was dead. Slavery was abolished. Jerome stood with Moses and Marcus as Union soldiers celebrated around them. But the 3 men remained quiet, emotions too complex for simple celebration. We're free, Marcus said hollowly. Actually, legally free. We were free the moment we walked away from that plantation, Moses corrected. And the men who enslaved us? Jerome asked. The system that enabled them? No one had good answers. The war was over, but reconstruction was beginning. The fight would continue in different forms, but this was victory. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. 4 million people freed. Children born who'd never know slavery except as history. Captain Hartley found Jerome later. It's over. You're free to go. Your service is complete. What happens to you? Back to civilian life. Try to remember what it was like to not live in constant fear. Hartley paused. What about you? I think I need to go back to Maryland, Jerome said. There are people buried there who deserve to be remembered, honored. That's dangerous, Hartley warned. People still believe you murdered their loved ones. I know the risks. But those people, Naomi, our child, all the others, they can't speak for themselves. Someone needs to tell their story. Hartley studied him. You're braver than I am. Just be careful. They shook hands, and Jerome felt gratitude and loss. This was goodbye. Moses, Marcus, and Jerome left together, their discharge papers declaring them freedmen. They traveled back to Washington County in late April, just after Lincoln's assassination. The journey took them through transformed landscape, scarred by war, but also showing hope. Black families traveling openly, children attending schools, churches being built. This was what Naomi had died for, Jerome thought. This imperfect, fragile freedom. They reached the plantation ruins on a warm spring day. Even more desolate now, vines covering foundations, fields gone to seed. But the bare ground where the dark place stood remained unchanged. Jerome stood at that edge, thinking about Halloween night. 3 years had passed, but felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago. We need to mark this place, Jerome said. Build something that tells the truth. What truth? Marcus asked. Confederate raiders? Or ancient darkness? The truth that matters, Jerome replied. That people suffered here. That they fought back. That they won freedom at terrible cost. Over the next week, they created a memorial. They salvaged stones from ruins and marked where the dark place had stood. They carved names into wood, Naomi's name, and others who'd died there over the years. It wasn't much. It wouldn't last forever. But it was something, a marker, a testimony. On their last day as the sun set, Jerome spoke to the ground where Naomi had died. I'm leaving now, going north, trying to build something new. But I won't forget you. Won't forget what you sacrificed. The wind picked up and Jerome heard a voice in it, faint but unmistakably Naomi's. Go, live, be happy. That's the best revenge, Jerome smiled through tears. I'll try. I promise. They left the next morning, heading toward uncertain but unshackled future. Behind them, the memorial stood watch, silent testimony to the night when darkness rose and demanded justice. The Kenny plantation would never be rebuilt. The ground would remain scarred, but the memorial would endure. Testimony to Halloween 1862, 7 bodies, a revenge written in blood, and one man carrying the memory forward, determined the sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. 53 years later in 1918, an old man sat in a small Philadelphia house, writing by lamplight. His hands shook with age, eyesight failing, but his mind remained sharp. Jerome Freeman, 90 years old and nearing the end, had a testimony to complete. He'd waited until now, until most who might be endangered were gone. Until the story could be told without immediate consequences. Captain Hartley had died in 1899, Thaddeus Crane in 1910, Moses in 1915 at 103. Marcus last year from pneumonia. Jerome was the last survivor of Halloween night, the last who could testify to what really happened. So he wrote, not the sanitized version about Confederate raiders, but the truth, all of it. The darkness, the suffering, Naomi's terrible bargain, the 7 men who'd paid with their lives. He wrote about Kenny and the dark place, about 15 years feeding ancient hunger, about Naomi's death in childbirth, their stillborn child, the rage that opened doors to powers beyond understanding. He wrote about fog and ghosts, about Pierce's corpse walking and Kenny's screams, about men called to judgment by forces they'd denied. He wrote about survival, about 3 years as a Union scout, about war's end and reconstruction, and the long process of building life in freedom. The account ran to nearly 100 pages, every detail preserved. When done, he sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Pennsylvania Historical Society with instructions: open and publish 50 years after his death. 50 years should be enough time. Enough for immediate wounds to heal, for slavery to be distant enough for historical perspective, for supernatural elements to be received as testimony rather than madness. He hoped. Jerome died peacefully in 1920. His funeral was small. His obituary noting he'd been born into slavery, served as Union scout, lived to see the country transformed, though not perfected. The obituary didn't mention Halloween night. Those details were sealed, waiting, and wait they did. Through the 20s and Depression, through World War II and Korea and Vietnam, through civil rights and assassinations, and long reckoning with racial history. In 1971, 1 year late due to archival backlog, the envelope was opened. Dr. Margaret Chen, the Historical Society director, read Jerome's manuscript with growing astonishment. She'd seen many accounts of slavery and civil war, but nothing like this. The supernatural elements were unlike anything in the record, detailed and specific and impossible to verify. She faced a dilemma. The manuscript was valuable as primary source. Jerome's account of daily life under slavery, Union Army descriptions, Reconstruction observations, all historically significant. But Halloween night, with darkness and vengeance and Walking Dead, seemed problematic, like fiction. She consulted with historians, folklorists, scholars. Consensus was mixed. Some wanted to publish everything exactly as written, honoring Jerome's testimony regardless of how fantastical. Others wanted to edit out supernatural components, preserving only verifiable material. Dr. Chen decided to honor both perspectives, publish the entire manuscript with extensive annotations, present supernatural elements as possibly metaphorical, Jerome's way of processing trauma and expressing incomprehensible horror. Verify historical elements against other records where possible. The testimony of Jerome Freeman, slavery, vengeance, and the Halloween night of 1862 was published in 1973 as part of the Society's monograph series. It received modest academic attention. Scholars praised vivid descriptions and psychological insight while remaining diplomatically silent about fantastical elements, but the manuscript found another audience, people interested in supernatural folklore, dark American history. They read Jerome's account not as metaphor but as testimony, literal truth about what happened when human cruelty fed ancient darkness. Over following decades, the Kenny Plantation site became pilgrimage destination. The land was absorbed into a state park, ruins cleared, fields returned to forest. But those who knew where to look could find Jerome's memorial, weathered, barely legible but standing. And they could find the bare patch where nothing would grow. Local legends grew. Strange fogs on Halloween, crying in darkness, shapes that might be human or something else. Park Service officially dismissed such tales, but rangers avoided that section when they could. In 2012, exactly 150 years after Halloween night, historians and paranormal investigators conducted extensive study. Ground-penetrating radar found anomalies, mineral concentrations that shouldn't exist, patterns suggesting repeated burning at impossible temperatures, and something else. An absence, a void where something should be but wasn't. They also found bones. Human bones scattered around where the dark place stood. DNA testing confirmed they belonged to multiple individuals of African descent, showing signs of violence and malnutrition consistent with slavery. The remains were given proper burial, with a memorial service drawing hundreds, descendants of enslaved people from across Maryland and beyond, come to honor those who'd suffered and died. Jerome's manuscript was reissued in 2015 with new annotations and historical context, including testimonies from other enslaved people who'd survived similar horrors. Supernatural elements remained controversial, impossible to prove or disprove, but they no longer seemed quite as fantastical. The more researchers learned about slavery's systematic horror, calculated cruelty, psychological torture, complete disregard for human dignity, the more Jerome's account of ancient darkness rising up seemed almost reasonable. Today, the Kenny Plantation site is part of Maryland Civil War Heritage Trail, A small museum tells the story of slavery in Washington County, of the 15 people held in bondage, of Naomi and Jerome and their stillborn child. It tells Halloween night too, presenting both historical facts and Jerome's metaphysical interpretation, letting visitors decide what they believe. The bare ground where the dark place stood is fenced off, protected as historical site but kept separate. A simple plaque reads, "Here stood the building known as the dark place where enslaved people were tortured. On Halloween night 1862, 7 men died and 15 souls were freed. The circumstances remain contested, but the suffering and liberation are historical record. May this ground remind us that justice, however delayed, however terrible, will ultimately be satisfied. Every Halloween, people gather. Some honor those who suffered. Some hope to glimpse supernatural forces Jerome described. Some come because the story haunts them, because they need to stand on that cursed ground and remember that evil is real, that suffering demands response, that some debts are paid in blood. Late at night, when crowds are gone and the moon is dark, those who remain sometimes hear it, a woman singing an unfinished lullaby, a child's cry never heard in life, the whisper of wind through a barn that no longer exists, carrying echoes that refuse to be forgotten. Jerome's testimony endures, not as proof of supernatural, not as verified history, but as something more important, a reminder that cruelty has consequences, that suffering leaves scars on the world itself, that justice might come in forms we can't anticipate or control. 7 bodies, a revenge written in blood, one man's testimony carried across a century, ensuring Naomi and their child and all who suffered would never be forgotten. That was Jerome's final gift, not just the story, but the insistence that it mattered, that those lives mattered, that something in the universe refuses to let cruelty go unanswered forever. Whether you believe in ghosts or ancient boundaries or supernatural vengeance, that truth remains. The Kenny plantation happened. The suffering was real. And on Halloween 1862, something, whether human rage or cosmic justice or darkness in cursed ground, rose up and said, "Enough." The dead were avenged. The living were freed. And the story lived on, testament to the night when the boundary grew thin and the price of cruelty was finally terribly paid. 7 years after Jerome Freeman's death, a young black journalist named Marcus Thompson arrived in Washington County with a purpose. He'd read Jerome's testimony and wanted to find the others who'd been there Halloween night. An elderly woman named Ruth Williams gave him a lead. There's a woman in Cumberland who might talk. Sarah Freeman, she was there. Marcus found Sarah at 81, her eyes still sharp. Before he could introduce himself, she said, "You're here about Halloween. I wondered when someone would come asking." Over tea, Sarah told her story. She'd been locked in the slave quarters that night, hadn't witnessed the killing directly. "But I heard it. The screams, voices that weren't human, the dark place singing. Do you believe something supernatural happened?" Marcus asked carefully. "I believe that place was evil, that Kenny fed it with suffering for 15 years. And when Naomi died giving birth in that darkness, something answered." She leaned forward. "But we weren't the only ones. There were other plantations, other dark places. The nights when justice came in forms that couldn't be explained." She handed him a worn journal. "I kept notes, names, dates, places. Whenever I heard a story like ours, something that happened on threshold days when the veil was thin, I wrote it down." Marcus stared at the journal. This was bigger than one night. This was a pattern. Why keep track? Because the story needs to be told. Not just ours, all of them. Every place where suffering tore through to something else. She handed him the journal. "Take it, I'm 81. These stories need preserving before everyone who remembers is gone." Over 3 years, Marcus traveled the South, tracking incidents Sarah had documented. He found a pattern. At least 17 locations across 7 states where plantation owners died under mysterious circumstances between 1861 and 1865. Deaths that couldn't be explained. Bodies in impossible conditions. Witnesses reporting phenomena like Jerome described. Unnatural fog. Voices in darkness. The dead walking. Most were officially attributed to slave uprisings or war violence. But survivors' accounts told different stories. Stories about threshold days, Halloween, All Souls' Day, winter solstice. Stories about places where suffering concentrated. Stories about bargains with darkness. In 1928, Marcus published Threshold: Supernatural Justice in the Final Years of American Slavery. Academia dismissed it as folklore, but it found an audience among those who'd lived through slavery's end, who understood some truths couldn't be captured conventionally. A white historian wrote, "An unfortunate example of how superstition and racial grievance distort historical fact." But a black minister wrote Marcus, "Thank you for telling the stories that needed telling. My grandmother experienced what you describe. She said the earth itself rebelled against what was being done to God's children. I believe her." Marcus's research connected him with others pursuing similar work, a folklorist documenting supernatural beliefs, an anthropologist studying threshold days, a spiritualist claiming to communicate with those who died in dark places. Together, they formed a network, mapping supernatural incidents, looking for patterns. What emerged was a theory none could prove, but all believed. Extreme suffering could thin the boundary between worlds. On specific days when the veil was naturally thin, something could break through. Justice, vengeance, or the universe refusing more cruelty. The Kenny plantation wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger phenomenon, a cosmic correction accompanying slavery's end. In 1932, Marcus returned to the Kenny plantation site. He was 45 now, career established despite controversy. The memorial Jerome built still stood. The bare patch where the dark place stood remained unchanged. 70 years and nothing would grow. He wrote in his notebook, "On this ground, Halloween 1862, the boundary grew thin enough for justice to pass through. 7 cruel men paid the price. 15 people went free, and the darkness fed with suffering was finally satisfied." This wasn't the first time, wasn't the last, but it was best documented, thanks to Jerome Freeman's courage. May we honor that courage by refusing to forget. Marcus died in 1967, 1 year before Jerome's testimony was scheduled for public release. But his work endured. His book was reprinted in the 1970s. His research became resources for scholars. His insistence that supernatural accounts deserved serious consideration helped shift how historians approached witness. Statements that didn't fit conventional narratives. The Kenny plantation remained a focal point, not just because of Jerome's detailed account, but because physical evidence was undeniable, ground that wouldn't heal. 7 documented deaths under impossible circumstances, multiple survivors pointing to the same incomprehensible night. Every Halloween, when the boundary grew thin, visitors could feel it. Something in the air, in the ground, whispering that this place remembered, that the dead weren't quite gone, that justice once delivered left an imprint time couldn't erase. The witnesses had spoken. The stories were preserved, and the darkness, whether literal or metaphorical, cosmic justice or shared trauma, continued reminding anyone who'd listen that some debts are paid in blood. Some nights tear holes in the world, and some truths are too big for conventional history to contain. 100 years after Halloween night, the Kenny plantation site, now part of Gathland State Park, prepared for a centennial commemoration. Dr. James Morrison, a University of Maryland historian, had spent 5 years researching October 31st, 1862. He'd read Jerome's testimony, studied Marcus Thompson's research, interviewed descendants, examined every document. Now he was organizing an event, bringing together historians, descendants, folklorists, and paranormal researchers, scheduled for October 31st, 1962, Halloween night. Exactly 100 years later, you're conducting a historical conference on cursed ground on Halloween at the exact centennial. His department chair had asked incredulously, but Morrison was committed. If we're ever going to understand what happened, really understand it, we need to engage seriously. Not dismiss it, not sensationalize it, but examine it as genuine historical phenomenon. Approximately 75 people gathered. Half academics, historians, anthropologists, folklorists, half descendants of those who'd been there that night, among them Dorothy Freeman Hayes, 78, Jerome's granddaughter, and Thomas Kenny III, 62, Leander Kenny's great-grandson, who'd spent his life trying to understand and atone for his ancestors' actions. "My family pretended none of it happened," Thomas said. "But I found letters, documents. I know what he did. And I think what happened to him was justice, however it came." As the sun set, the group gathered near where the dark place had stood. The bare patch remained. Still, nothing would grow after a century. Dr. Morrison read from Jerome's testimony, describing Naomi's death, the bargain with darkness, the 7 men who paid. As he read, the temperature dropped. Several people felt a presence, something watching, listening. Descendants spoke. Dorothy Freeman Hayes first. "My grandfather lived to 90, built a life after slavery, but he never forgot Halloween night, never forgot what Naomi sacrificed. This ground is their grave, their memorial. Naomi Freeman, their unnamed child. They mattered." Thomas Kenny III spoke, voice heavy. "I can't apologize for what my great-grandfather did. Words are meaningless against that evil. But I can say clearly, Leander Kenny deserved what happened. Every moment of terror, and I'm glad justice came, even in that terrible form." As more descendants spoke, something strange happened. Temperature continued dropping. Fog rolled in, thin then thicker, moving unnaturally with purpose, exactly as Jerome described. People grew nervous. This was exactly what had been reported a century ago. Coincidence? Natural fog on Halloween? Or something else? Dr. Morrison suggested they continue. A folklorist gave a presentation on threshold days across cultures, times when the boundary between worlds grew thin. Halloween, All Souls' Day, winter solstice, when the dead could walk, when justice could cross realms. As she spoke, the fog thickened. Then people heard it, faint, then clearer. A woman's voice singing. A lullaby, sad and sweet and incomplete. Dorothy Freeman Hayes began crying. "That's her. That's Naomi." My grandfather described her voice. "That's her!" Academics struggled to maintain professional skepticism. Descendants seemed less surprised. They'd grown up with stories of the plantation being haunted. A child's cry joined the singing, not pain, but recognition, as if an infant who'd never lived was finally being acknowledged. Thomas Kenny III dropped to his knees. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what he did. I'm sorry for all of it." The fog swirled around him, not threateningly, but like acknowledgement, recognition that this descendant understood. Carried no malice, only sorrow. Dr. Morrison found himself speaking to the fog. "We're here to remember, to honor those who suffered, to make sure the story is told truthfully, to ensure Naomi and her child are never forgotten." The temperature rose. The fog receded, and the singing, Naomi's voice, faded not with sadness but with peace, as if the commemoration, the truth-telling, had provided something the spirits needed. By midnight the fog had completely gone. The group stood in stunned silence. Had it been genuine supernatural manifestation? Mass hallucination? Natural phenomenon that coincidentally aligned with the narrative? Dr. Morrison knew he could never prove what happened, but he knew what he'd experienced. What they'd all experienced. Something had been present. Something had responded. Whether ghosts, ancestral spirits, or psychological weight of trauma made manifest, it was real. Dorothy Freeman Hayes wrote to Morrison later, "My grandfather spent 50 years carrying that memory. He wrote it down so others would know what Naomi sacrificed. And on the 100th anniversary, she came back to hear us remember her. That's not supernatural in the scary sense. That's love. That's connection across death and time." Dr. Morrison published a careful paper, The Psychology of Historical Memory, Collective Experience at a Trauma Site. It discussed how groups process trauma, how place holds memory, how commemoration creates shared experiences that feel supernatural. The paper was well received. It didn't claim anything paranormal, just documented that 75 people shared an intense experience at a historically significant site. But Morrison kept a private journal. "Something happened that night. I heard Naomi's voice. We all did. And whatever that was, ghost, memory, the earth speaking, it was real. As real as any historical fact I've encountered, the centennial brought renewed attention to the Kenny plantation, to Jerome's testimony, to the pattern Marcus Thompson documented. The 1960s were a time of renewed interest in African American history, of confronting uncomfortable truths. Halloween 1862 fit perfectly. A story about resistance, about justice with no legal recourse, about freedom's cost. Whether supernatural elements were literal or metaphorical almost didn't matter. The core truth resonated. The Kenny plantation became pilgrimage destination, not just for paranormal enthusiasts, but for those seeking to understand slavery's legacy in all its complexity. The bare ground remained bare. Jerome's memorial stood, supplemented by Park Service markers. And every Halloween, people gathered to remember. Sometimes fog rolled in, sometimes singing, sometimes nothing, but the commemoration continued year after year. A ritual honoring not just historical facts but deeper truth, that suffering demands acknowledgement, that the dead deserve remembering, and that justice leaves marks time cannot erase. Dorothy Freeman Hayes attended every year until her death in 1989, Thomas Kenny III until 1995, Dr. Morrison until retirement in 1994 on. His final visit at 78, Morrison stood alone late Halloween night. Fog rolled in, and he heard voices. "Thank you," he whispered to the darkness. "Thank you for trusting us with your story, for letting us remember." The fog swirled gently, almost affectionately. Morrison felt a presence, not threatening, just present, bearing witness to his witness. Then the fog cleared, and he was alone, with the memorial and bare ground and the weight of history. But he wasn't afraid. He felt honored to have been trusted with this story, honored to have helped ensure it would never be forgotten. The centennial proved something. The dead were still present, still demanding to be remembered. And as long as people listened, honored, commemorated, the story would continue. Halloween 1862 would never be erased. Naomi would never be forgotten. And the darkness that delivered justice remained part of the record, inexplicable and undeniable. Present day, October 31st, 2025, the Kenny Plantation site has become one of the most documented paranormal locations in American history. Dr. Sarah Chen Morrison, 42, great-granddaughter of Dr. James Morrison, stands where her great-grandfather stood 63 years ago. She's a Johns Hopkins historian, specializing in what she calls threshold history, events at the boundary between documented fact and inexplicable experience. The site has changed. A visitors center now operates, with exhibits about slavery in Washington County and, controversially, full presentation of Jerome's testimony, including supernatural elements. For too long, the exhibit reads, historians dismiss supernatural resistance as folklore, but witnesses insisted their experiences were real. This exhibit honors their testimony exactly as given, trusting that those who suffered have the right to define their own experiences. Sarah is here for the 163rd anniversary, conducting a study of the site's psychological and possibly paranormal effects. With her, Dr. Marcus Freeman Thompson, descendant of both Jerome and Marcus Thompson, working as a parapsychologist, Dr. Elizabeth Santos, a physicist interested in quantum theories explaining consciousness surviving death, and Thomas Kenny Thieve, great-great-great-grandson of Leander Kenny, now a social justice lawyer dedicated to reparations. The younger Thomas carries a different burden. "My ancestor fed suffering to darkness. The least I can do is feed resources to healing." As Halloween night approaches, 200 people gather, descendants, historians, researchers, curious visitors. The event has become famous, documented in journals, magazines, books, and podcasts examining haunted sites through a social justice lens. Sarah begins by reading Jerome's testimony, tradition maintained since 1962, but this year they've created a dramatic reading with multiple voices and sound design, wanting people to experience Jerome's words as he wrote them. As the reading concludes, the sun sets. The bare patch where the dark place stood remains visible, still refusing life after 163 years. Dr. Santos activates equipment. Electromagnetic field detectors immediately show anomalies. The EM field is fluctuating in patterns I've never seen. Not random, but not matching any known natural source. The fog begins rolling in. By now, this is almost expected. Halloween fog here is so common, meteorologists have studied it. The official explanation involves topography and temperature differentials. But the timing, almost always October 31st during the commemoration, strains belief in coincidence. As fog thickens, people report experiences. Some hear singing, Naomi's lullaby. Some see shapes that might be human. Some simply feel a presence, not threatening but intensely aware. Sarah's thermal cameras capture heat signatures in human form that appear and disappear. She records everything. Knowing skeptics will find explanations, but also knowing those present will believe what they experience. A young woman, Melissa Williams, descendant of one of the enslaved workers, begins crying. I feel her. My great-great-great-grandmother. She's here. She wants us to know she survived, made it north, lived to see freedom, died old and surrounded by family. Is this genuine communication with the dead? Melissa processing family trauma? Is there even a meaningful difference? Sarah doesn't claim to know. What she documents is that people experience something powerful here, that these experiences follow patterns established over 163 years, and that the boundary between historical memory and active spiritual presence seems genuinely thin. Around midnight, something remarkable happens. The fog suddenly clears in a perfect circle around the memorial. In that circle, visible to everyone, the air shimmers for just a moment. Captured on dozens of cameras, documented by Sarah's equipment, there are figures. Transparent, barely visible, but unmistakably human. 15 figures, standing in a circle around the memorial. Dr. Santos's equipment spikes off the charts. Thermal cameras show heat signatures matching human body temperature. Digital recorders capture voices, whispers, that familiar lullaby. The figures remain visible for 90 seconds. Long enough for everyone to see, to recognize what they're witnessing. To understand that, whether through quantum physics or consciousness surviving death or unexplained phenomena, the dead are present. Then the figures fade. The fog closes back in. The sight returns to normal. Sarah stops all recordings, makes careful notes. She knows this will be studied for years, argued over, analyzed from every angle. Skeptics will find explanations. Believers will claim proof. Most will land somewhere between. But for those present Halloween 2025, there's no doubt. They saw the 15. They felt the presence. They witnessed the boundary between worlds dissolving completely. As the crowd disperses, Sarah stays with her team, reviewing footage. This will change everything, Marcus says, or nothing, Dr. Santos counters. Because people see what they want to see. Sarah thinks about her great-grandfather, about Jerome Freeman, about Marcus Thompson, about everyone who'd stood on this cursed ground over 163 years and felt something inexplicable. Maybe the point isn't proving anything. Maybe it's remembering, honoring, making sure the story continues being told. Whether Naomi's spirit literally appears or lives only in collective memory, she's present either way. The suffering was real. The resistance was real. The cost was real. And this ground remembers. She looks at the bare patch. This is what trauma looks like when it scars the earth itself. This is what justice looks like from places deeper than law. This is what memory looks like when it refuses to be erased. Thomas Kenny V pauses at the memorial, places flowers, lilies, Naomi's favorite, and speaks softly. I know you can't forgive my ancestor, but I want you to know we're trying to do better. That your sacrifice, your story, your refusal to be forgotten, it's changing people, making us confront the truth. And that truth is the beginning of everything else. The fog swirls gently around him, and he swears he feels a hand on his shoulder. Brief, light, acknowledging. It's enough. Sarah publishes her findings. Threshold phenomena at sites of historical trauma. The Kenny Plantation case study. Part history, part psychology, part quantum physics. part paranormal research, not controversial as expected. Some praise its boldness, others dismiss it as pseudoscience, but it sparks necessary conversations about how we study history, honor testimony that doesn't fit conventional frameworks, and explain phenomena at the boundary between known and unknown. Most importantly, it brings renewed attention to Jerome's testimony and the pattern Marcus Thompson documented. Universities offer courses on supernatural resistance during slavery. Documentaries are produced, more sites identified and studied. The hidden history becomes less hidden. Every Halloween, commemorations continue. At the Kenny Plantation and other locations, places where the boundary is thin, where suffering concentrated, where something impossible happened that nevertheless shaped history, people gather to remember, to witness, to experience whatever manifests when the veil grows thin. Sometimes fog, sometimes voices, sometimes figures in darkness, sometimes nothing unusual, but the story continues. The dead continue to be remembered, and the truth, however inexplicable, however uncomfortable, continues to be told. Jerome Freeman wrote, "May this record ensure that Naomi and our child and all who suffered are never forgotten." And years later, the prayer has been answered. They are remembered. They are honored. Their story is told and retold, studied and documented, argued over and witnessed, and on Halloween night when the boundary grows thin, they are present, whether as literal spirits or memory made manifest, quantum phenomenon or psychological projection. Truth literal or metaphorical, they are present, they witness, they remember, and so do we, 7 bodies, a revenge written in blood, and 163 years of witnesses carrying the story forward, ensuring Halloween, 1862, will never be erased, never explained away, never forgotten. That is the eternal witness. That is the testament that endures. That is the truth that matters.